All right, so today, like I said, it's a very Halloween, October thematic topic we're looking at today, and that is some of nature's poisons. I will preempt this by saying that this is by no means an exhaustive presentation. There is just about every rabbit hole that you can imagine that we could go down here. And every subtopic, every individual plant or animal that we talk about would deserve its own presentation any day of the week. So if you are interested, let me know what you're interested in to hear more about, and I'd be happy to do a follow-up to this if I'm able. So today we're going to look at our three major categories. We're going to delve into animals, plants, and into fungus. I will let you know that we're going to spend most of our time on plants today because that's really where my heaviest interest with nature's poisons lie, but I would be remiss not to touch on the others. All right, so we're going to start out with our animals here. And before we get started, there's always the question of poison versus venom. Is it a venomous snake? Is it a poisonous snake? Well, it's going to be a venomous snake unless it is one of about maybe one or two snakes on the planet that is also poisonous. So if it's poisonous, it means that you eat it and get sick. If it's venomous, it means that it eats you and you get sick. So the main idea here is poison is something that you're going to ingest or inhale, or that's going to come in contact with your skin. It's going to be absorbed, and that's where the issue is going to lie. Or if it's venomous, it means that it's going to bite you, it's going to sting you, it's going to poke you and inject you with the thing that is going to be harmful. So you can kind of think of venom and viper, or think of the V as a sort of biting mouth to help you remember. So snakes are generally almost always venomous rather than poisonous. So what venomous snakes do we have around? Well, we have three in New York, one or two of which are much more likely to see than the one in the middle there. So we have our timber rattlesnake. And what I've listed below each one of these are just some of the compounds that you can find in the venom itself. So the timber rattlesnake, they say, has a slightly less complex venom, although it's kind of hard to believe based on what's listed here. We also have the snake in the middle, and this is one that has a small rattle at the end of it. It looks similar, but we really only have this in two very swampy, small parts of New York. So this generally is not a snake you're going to come across very often. And finally, we have the copperhead, which I have had the good fortune to see in this last year, but it is not something terribly common unless you like to hang out in the same spots that snakes really like to hang out, which I'm sure a few of you do, but you probably also know to watch your ankles. Like with a lot of animals, these are not looking to inject you with their venom for no reason. It's likely going to be because you both ended up in a situation that you didn't mean to. Like you are walking on a trail and you just happen to step on a snake. And if someone stepped on you, you might snap. So they might snap at you. Some snakes, like the Massasauga, it really only injects venom some of the times because it's really resource intensive for them to produce this venom. And so it's not something that they want to have to use all the time. So most of the time, I'd say they actually just do what's called a dry bite. So they don't actually inject you with anything. And again, so these are all venomous, not poisonous. To give you an idea of the complexity of the type of compounds that we're talking about in snake venom and in a lot of poisons and venoms, we have two major types, ones that affect the blood and ones that affect the nervous system. So despite the fact that there are a ton of animals, a ton of organisms that have come up with these compounds, a lot of them have come up with it independently. And we find that no matter what, they tend to fall into these two groups of these really effective sort of attacks to get the prey. And how that happens is a number of ways. It can happen because the DNA is duplicated. So they have at least one set to do what it's supposed to. And then if that second set mutates any further, even if it's a slight advantage, really mild toxin, and they bite their prey, it helps them a little bit, then that gene might get passed on, and it has in a number of species that are totally or relatively unrelated, and they all come to this sort of similar conclusion here. So it gives you just a small idea of the complexity and the different ways that they accomplish this similar task. So we're not going to look at all these animals here today clearly, but we are going to look at a few. So we talked about the venomous snakes. Now we're going to talk about those poisonous animals. So the ones that aren't biting you, but if you happen to ingest or take into your systems one of their poisons, it's also potentially toxic, either for you or maybe a smaller animal that would be their natural prey. So you have your golden poison frog, and he has a toxin that he actually doesn't make himself. They are pretty sure that it eats a beetle and it takes that toxin in from the beetle and then will secrete it through its skin. And so this is defensive. So whereas both of these poisonous and venomous can be both defensive and offensive, poisons are going to be mostly a defensive mechanism, and that is because it's really only going to come into contact with you or another animal if these guys are in their mouth or in our mouth. So that would mean that, we are trying to attack them, and at that point we get the toxin. So we have our poison frogs. Some of these, as I'm sure you know, have been used to tip darts in certain cultures. We have a monarch butterfly. The monarch does something really cool. If any of you know that monarchs, the caterpillars, hang out on milkweed and they eat the milkweed. It looks like I forgot to change the middle. It says endangered here. I forgot to change that middle piece there, but they eat the milkweed and they subsequently receive the toxin from the milkweed itself, which lasts into their adult form as the butterfly. So if anything goes to eat the butterfly, it's going to get a pretty upset stomach. If we eat a monarch, it's not going to do that much to us because of the toxicity is so small relative to our size. Then you have the pufferfish. So similarly, it's also going to ingest an outside source of a toxin from a marine bacteria in order to receive its neurotoxin. And so pufferfish is one that really can be dangerous to humans. In certain areas of the world, pufferfish is a delicacy. And if it's not prepared properly, we can get easily a lethal dose of neurotoxin from eating that pufferfish. So we try to eat it, but it might sort of, in a way, eat us instead. All right, so not to say that we got the animals out of the way because they're important, but a few notes just before we move on to the plants. So venom and these poison happen in a number of different species, like we said. So that is everything from the snakes, the jellyfish, spiders, scorpions, centipedes, if bees, as we know, cone snails, newts, the platypus. And if anybody's seen the slow loris videos, they'll know that sometimes they see someone tickle a slow loris, which is a primate, and it will lift up its arms, and it looks really cute, right? What it's actually doing is lifting up because it has these glands on its elbows that will release a toxin, and what they'll do is they'll lick that toxin and in case they have to bite so that they can hurt you with it. So it looks really cute that they're lifting their arms up, but that's not actually what's going on. And so they they target the channels and the receptors on neurons and the molecules involved in blood clotting. All right, now we will move on to our plants. Let's talk about one that we all have probably seen around, and that's poison ivy. It's native to here, and most of you, if not all of you, likely get a reaction from the urushiol. And that is something that about 80% of the population will react to. I am one of those people that don't seem to react to poison ivy, but I like to not rub it on myself to find out, as that is something that you can also develop. About 10 to 15% of people actually get a really severe reaction that can last for weeks and be potentially much more dangerous, and they could end up in the hospital. They need, certain medications, so on and so forth. But some people don't consider poison ivy and the urushiol to be a poison so much as an allergen, because what it's doing is it's causing an allergic reaction in you in a dissimilar way to some of how these other poisons work. But it does, as we know, cause that rash with potential severe itching, known as contact dermatitis. Similar, with using the same allergen, is poison sumac and poison oak. Poison sumac is not usually the sumac that you're going to see around. This one's going to be in more marshy areas. and poison oak as well. It's not something that you'll necessarily come into contact with frequently. Some of these are sometimes used as for decorative purposes in lawns, but I think most people try to keep these away from them as much as possible. Giant hogweed is another one that you may see around. And this is one I'm going to preempt with mega super real danger with this one. The most likely place I'd say you are to see it is the side of a highway. And if you do find this, which we'll talk a little bit more about what to look for to identify it, definitely tell the DEC because they want to know exactly where this plant is because it's a major problem. It can grow 8-10 feet tall. It is really a massive plant. You can see it as these sort of jagged, almost parsley-like leaves. It is part of the carrot family. And it's got sort of what looks like Queen Anne's lace flowers up top. And again, these are really massive plants. And the issue is if you get any of the sap from the leaves, from the stem, from cutting it open in any way, even rubbing on it, if it has anything open on itself, what it's going to do is it's going to make you extremely sensitive to the sun. So for the next 10 minutes to about 2 to 4 hours, if you go in the sun, it's going to cause severe, severe burns. And these are things that will welt up, they will balloon up, you will get these horrible, nasty blisters anywhere where the sap has touched. And these are things that last weeks and weeks and weeks until they resolve. And they usually resolve with rather gnarly scars. So if you do come in contact with this, do let the DEC know. And they will come and take care of it. What happens sometimes, unfortunately, is highway crews will come through and they will mow the grass. And so if they mow this, you can only imagine what happens to the sap as it just goes soaring through the air and can potentially really hurt someone. And if it does happen to get into somebody's eyes, it will, at the very least, blind them for a bit, if not permanently. It's a rather large issue. So be on the lookout and tell the DEC if you find it. If you go to the DEC's website, you will also see a map where it has been found in the past. And this is a little bit blurry, but you can kind of see most of these are in the same family, what it might look like. Any of these, do not eat. There's no need to rub them on you. Most of the plants in this family will cause either some sort of burns or have the poison, and it's not good. So if you are foraging, some people do forage with some plants that look similar to these. Just make sure you know what you're eating. If you're not sure, don't eat it. And if you are sure, second guess yourself. All right. On the last list of ones that you might find in or around your backyard is stinging nettle. I'd be interested after this to hear from anybody who has come in contact with stinging nettle. It's not all that uncommon. I have certainly accidentally found myself in the middle of a field of stinging nettle, and there's really only one way out at that point, and that is through. And the reason that that is so difficult and so painful is if you look on this photo, you'll see these little spines coming off of the leaf. And each one of those is this horrible little kind of hypodermic-like needle. And there's just a trillion of them. And once you brush it, it cracks off the end of it, sort of like a glow stick, pops off the top. And the pressure of the inside of the plant actually shoots out those toxins into you. And what that does is it's nothing horrendous, but it does really, really hurt. And it hurts a lot more than like a bee sting or a lot more than like 5 bee stings, but it hurts for a little bit and you're generally okay. Nettles are commonly used for tinctures and sometimes teas. What happens is if you dress them correctly and you break down these needles, it will no longer be harmful, and it apparently makes a nice tea. I haven't had the opportunity to try it myself, but I would, because if anything, prepared properly can be safe as well. All right, now we're moving on to some of the more fun kind of historical plants that we have out there. You might find these around, but they are not native to here. This is maybe something that you might find in a sort of specialized garden, and that is deadly nightshade, sometimes known as belladonna. And belladonna has a long and illustrious history throughout medieval Europe and other places of sort of ill will and murderous wives and murderous people and people who wanted other families who were in a position of ruling to go down. And as you can imagine, it's only been relatively recently that we've been able to detect these poisons. And some of these ones go away rather quickly even today. So they were these beautiful ways to get rid of a neighbor that you were on the outs with. And so something you'll see a lot is the type of poison here is an alkaloid. And alkaloids come in a bunch of different forms. The typical alkaloids are those derived from amino acids. And what they'll do is they have compounds that will cause seizures and paralysis. They'll cause hallucinations. They'll make you really sick to the point of vomiting. They'll interrupt your cell division, cause heart arrhythmias, and even a bunch of GI, gastrointestinal problems. So these can really run the gamut. They are very deadly, even in relatively small doses. You can see rapid heartbeat, confusion, hallucination, and seizures. Really gnarly stuff. The name belladonna comes from potentially two different sources. The original one that everyone thought was belladonna, which is Italian for beautiful woman. And that came about because you'll see in the photo of the eyes, one pupil's dilated. And so what these poor Italian women would do back in the day is they would take droppers of a belladonna solution. They would put it in their eyes a few times a day. And what that would do is it would dilate the pupil. And they thought that that was really beautiful. So they were essentially poisoning themselves, sometimes to the point of blindness, as that was taken into their body just for the sake of these dilated pupils. It contains a muscarinic antagonist, which blocks the receptors in the muscles of the eye that constrict the pupil size. So it was wide open, which aside from all the other hazardous reasons that this shouldn't have been done, could not have been a pleasant experience to everywhere they went, be able to, not shut their pupil to the amount of light that there was during the day. And then so some really fun things, aside from the causing blindness part, is this was considered one of the few main components of flying ointment, which is one of the origins of witches' association with flying and used as a hallucinogenic. It's sometimes referred to, along with others that have similar alkaloids, hot as a hare, red as a beet, dry as a bone, blind as a bat, and mad as a hatter, to describe the symptoms of someone coming in with this type of poisoning or a related type of poisoning. And this is a pneumatic that's still used today for people in the medical field to have a better idea of what they might be looking for if someone comes in with those symptoms. It is thought that the belladonna berries, which can look really enticing, were the ones used by Juliet of Romeo and Juliet as she killed herself. Nero murdered his half-brother Britannicus in the year AD 55 using a belladonna tincture from his professional poisoner, Locusta. And if you look up Locusta, she is gosh, I don't even know where to go. She is a force to be reckoned with back in the day. She was just about everyone's poisoner. She escaped death numerous times, sometimes through poison, sometimes through sweet talking who she had to when she had to avoid it. She was the favorite of so many rich families who didn't like another rich family. So she has her own rich history just by herself. Another belladonna poisoning. 11th century Scottish king Duncan I killed an army of invading Danes led by Viking Sven Knutson by feeding them belladonna infused liquor. So all sorts of issues here. The berries have more recently, I think it was in like 2006, some poor family came down with similar illness to what you see here in the pneumatic, and it was found out that they had been eating the berries. One woman, there's a story where she kind of went mad every year at a certain type of year, and then she would recover. And her daughter realized that she would go out and pick the belladonna berries and eat them each year for a few weeks at a time, and somehow she survived. One thing that you'll see come up a lot with these poisons is you don't know what one berry will have to the next in terms of toxin levels. You can have one where you'll be totally fine, or maybe you'll have a stomach ache, you'll feel a little weird, or you'll eat half of another berry and have a fatal reaction. All right, poison hemlock. Poison hemlock is another one with a rather long history going back to Socrates, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it also uses an alkaloid. The alkaloid being the main feature, but a lot of these have numerous compounds that they've developed that work in different ways. And so they'll do things that cause the neuromuscular dysfunction and respiratory failure, along with a host of other nasty symptoms. Those are just the ones that really tend to get you. So Socrates. Socrates died from hemlock poisoning. So in 399 BC, Socrates was accused of, quote, refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and for, quote, corrupting the youth. So 500 Athenians acted as his jury and decided that not only was he guilty, but that he should die. They asked Socrates what he thought, and first he suggested that he receive a government salary and free dinners for the rest of his life. That didn't go over great, so he followed that up with, all right, maybe I'll just pay a small fine. Would that be okay? And unfortunately for him, they said absolutely not, and they sentenced him to death by hemlock poisoning. And so it wasn't just hemlock, it was a few things in there, but that was the lead component. And so they had him go in with a few of his closest students and friends, and he drank this compound. He asked what to expect, and they said that your legs will get heavy. At that point, we'll ask you to lay down. And then from there, we'll ask you a series of questions to determine how far along the poison is. And then at that point, you will likely be dead. So someone that was not in the room, but spoke to someone that was in the room, wrote down what happened. And I'm not going to read the full thing here, but he said that Socrates walked around until he said that his legs were becoming heavy when he lay on his back as the attendant instructed. And then it goes through how first he couldn't feel his feet, and then he couldn't feel his legs, and then it moved up to his stomach and he couldn't feel that. And then he spoke a few more words, and just like that, then he was gone. And so it does have this sort of paralyzing feature. They make it sound in this story like Socrates just kind of sweetly and softly met death as he went for his final nap. But that's not always the case, or not usually the case with hemlock. It could have been that some of the other agents in the compound led him to kind of fall into this nice calm sleep, but that might be a bit more of a fairy tale that was left behind, as more often than not, people have these really violent and uncomfortable and seizure-like reactions to these levels of the poison. Early physicians also mixed up a brew of the deadly nightshade and hemlock and mandrake and henbane, another poison, and opium, amongst other herbs, as a surgical anesthetic. So while I'm sure it was nice not to feel the surgery potentially, it also would have been nice to wake up, which I'm sure quite a few patients were not able to. All right, manchineel tree. This is one that I only really heard about and learned about recently, despite the fact that it's available even in the United States and southern Florida, down into the Caribbean and into the northern areas of South America. It's part of the euphorbia family, which hosts quite a few poisonous plants. Most euphorbias that you'll come across are not good to eat, or you don't want to rub them on you, but the manchineel tree is its own sort of beast. So its Latin name actually means hippo or horse killer, rather. And then other languages call it the little apple of death, and it really truly is. So if you are ever in southern Florida and you come across this tree, just walk the other direction. And they often have large warning signs that I'll show you in a second to help you get out of the area where these are. Lightly before we move on, they cause skin irritation, blindness, throat swelling, and severe pain. But how do they do that? Well, these little apples of death should not be eaten. They are really painful if ingested and could easily cause death. You also can't stand under this tree if it rains, because if its sap, its little latexy sap, were to get on you, it causes severe burns. If it gets in your eyes, you'll at least be temporarily blind, if not permanently blind. And this has happened to a few people. So people who live, locals that live around these manchineel trees, absolutely know to stay away, especially if it is raining, but to steer clear of these fruits. So a paper written by radiologist Nicola Strickland in the year 2000, she was unfortunately in a Caribbean island and decided to eat one of these fruits, not because she thought she was a woman of steel, but because she just didn't know what it was. And so to quote her paper that she wrote of her experience, she said, "I rashly took a bite from this fruit and found it pleasantly sweet. My friend also partook at my suggestion. Moments later, we noticed a strange peppery feeling in our mouths, which gradually progressed to a burning, tearing sensation and tightness of the throat. The symptoms worsened over a couple of hours until we could barely swallow solid food because of the excruciating pain and the feeling of a huge obstructing pharyngeal lump Sadly, the pain was exacerbated by most alcoholic beverages, although mildly appeased by pina coladas, but more so by milk alone. Over the next 8 hours, our oral symptoms slowly began to subside, but our cervical lymph nodes became very tender and easily palpable. Recounting our experience, the locals elicited frank horror and incredulity. Such was the fruit's poisonous reputation. So unfortunately, they seem to have taken it rather well, but they did survive their encounter with the fruit. It is said that the fruit's sort of sweet to anyone who unfortunately does take a bite, but they quickly do start to get that sensation in their mouth and in their throat and throughout their body and their stomach, and have these terrible, terrible reactions. Juan Ponce de Leon, if we all kind of remember our high school history course, it said that the arrow that killed him was tipped with sap from this tree. It is important to note that while these plants can really harm us, it's not like their only purpose in life. These trees actually were not made because they didn't become poisonous because humans were some sort of threat they were fending off. It just so happens that we also react to this toxin. Their deep growing roots that you can see on the bottom there help prevent soil erosion, and it provides a safe home for some animals, surprisingly, that can take it. So the one that we know about is a striped iguana of Central and South America. It's the only animal that we know that can get up in there and eat the fruit. So it has the trees to itself safely. Jimson weed. Jimson weed's another interesting one, like the others, with an incredible history. And so you'll notice some of these families will repeat over and over and over, and that's because they tend to be the ones with the poison. Again, more alkaloids that do a whole suite of fun stuff: delirium, hallucination, hyperthermia, tachycardia, bizarre behavior, urinary retention, and severe mydriasis and death. I did not list a death for all of these, but really you have enough or even just a little bit of most of these, and you're in for some fatal reactions. So some history is Jimson weed. The name comes from Jamestown weed, weed originally. And so what would happen is sometimes the native people understood this, and so they had purposely or accidentally provided it to some of these colonizers that had come in to make them sick. Now, the people that were moving in quickly learned what it did as well and continued to use it against people that they were not in favor of. So Bacon's Rebellion, back in 1705-ish, that's when this account was written. What happened was there was a British governor, and he did not want to do certain things that the people in the colonies wanted him to do. And so there was an uprising, and in the midst of that, the people that were doing the uprising gave some of this Jimson weed to the soldiers that had come from Britain. And so what happened in this account was that, quote, one would blow up a feather in the air, another would dart straws at it with much fury, and another, stark naked, was sitting up in a corner like a monkey, grinning and making grimaces at them. A fourth would finally kiss and paw at his companions and sneer in their faces, with a countenance more antic than any in Dutch comedy. In this frantic condition, they were confined lest they should in their folly destroy themselves. And though it was observed that all their actions were full of innocence and good nature, they were not very cleanly, for they would have wallowed in their own excrement if they had not been prevented. So you can tell that this really is causing this absolute poisoned delirium and really sort of horrible trip that usually ends in severe vomiting. It's also known by a couple of names, such as stinkweed, thorn apple, prickly burr, devil's trumpet, devil's weed, hell's bells, moonflower, and mad apple. You can tell that almost all of those names tell you that this is not a plant that you want to mess with. The anticholinergic properties of these poisons, they block the actions of neurotransmitters between cells, which affect how your body will function. So it occurs about 30 minutes after ingesting a poison, and at high doses will just immediately kill you. As little as a half a teaspoon of the seeds can lead to seizures and cardiac arrest. Unfortunately, some people like to take the seeds on purpose. Some cultures do it in a way that at least they seem to have a basic understanding of how to not die immediately, although some of those happen as well. But some people like to use it recreationally, and that is a terrible, terrible idea because most of the people that use it recreationally probably only use it once. It is, people who have survived it say that it is absolutely not a fun recreational drug. It is known to cause absolutely horrible, terrifying, nightmarish hallucinations that last for an incredible amount of time with side effects that can go on for weeks into the future. And then it does end in that severe vomiting. So it's not the kind of thing that someone wants access to. There is a story about someone, because this is a readily available plant that people might have in their gardens. Someone was drying some seeds for their next year's garden above the stove, and someone that was cooking thought that it was a seasoning. So they picked them up and they put them into the soup. The whole family got very sick. They thankfully survived, but not fun for anybody to trace down what had happened there. And that was only, I think, in the early 2000s. So these things certainly still happen, and we still need to be careful with what we are ingesting purposely or accidentally. All right. Castor bean. All right. I wonder if anybody's heard of what's going on here, but the castor bean, as you can see in its Latin name, produces ricin, which is a very horrible, very terrible, very potent poison. So it's not as potent the way that it comes straight from the plant. You need to do some things in a lab in order to make it into the really terrible poison that is sometimes used by governments to get the people out that they don't want to be there anymore. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment, of assassinations using ricin. But it's still pretty potent in the plant as is. And this is a plant that you can just get in North America and most countries. There's no regulations against it. I think I was driving somewhere recently and I just saw someone had a huge plant of it on their front doorstep. And it's not something that you're going to brush again and you're going to get the sap of it and that's going to hurt you, which is good. You actually have to get it from the beans themselves. They aren't actually beans, they're technically seeds if you want to be correct. But what the ricin does is nausea, diarrhea, tachycardia, hypotension, seizures, and of course, death. A lot of these have similar symptoms because of these alkaloids that do very similar things in the body. Many of you might have heard of this. So Georgy Markov, he was a Bulgarian dissident and writer who had been a major irritant to his country's, Bulgaria's communist government. And so they retaliated by assassinating him. And how they did that was they had an umbrella like this one. And you can see the tip there, there's something a little funky going on. So they would drill out the tip. They would take the ricin, it would be covered in a wax sort of pill covering, and they would walk up. I think in the case of this one, it said that someone walked up, he heard them mumble sorry in a foreign accent. He felt something, just a small little pain, and then they walked away, they got in a taxi and they were gone. And so what they had done was they had walked up, they had just injected him really quickly with this very small pill of ricin, because it really doesn't take much to do the job. The wax coating went in, the wax coating was warmed up by his own body heat, it came off, and then the ricin went to work within his body. And I think 3 days later, he was dead. There have been 1 or 2 cases of people who there was an assassination attempt in this way and they actually survived, but they certainly went through it before they made it out the other side. So this is a particularly brutal one. Ricin also leaves the body really quickly. So even when they had a pretty good idea of what killed him, they ended up having to replicate or attempting to replicate this with a pig years later to prove that this is really how it would have and could have been done, and to kill him in that amount of time. So poor pig who had to go through that, but it helped us better understand how this poison works, and how to recognize it early on. Unfortunately, with a lot of these, there isn't something that we can currently do. So if someone were to unfortunately get a lethal dose of any of these, which in some cases, like I already said, can be quite small, there is not much that we can do. So the best case, aside from, I guess, not making the Bulgarian government angry, is to just not be eating things that you shouldn't eat. Understand what potential hazards you have close to home, for instance, like the giant hogweed. That one's not going to kill you, but it's really going to make you unhappy for quite a few weeks. So to understand what could be potential threats around you, and to be really careful if you are someone that forages, because that is the time when you're going to obviously be ingesting the biggest diversity of things and the biggest quantities of things that could potentially be harmful. in your house. So if you saw in the beginning, or if you can see behind me now, I have quite a few houseplants in my house. And this is only, as some people will let you know, a very small sprinkling of what I have going on here. But the vast majority of houseplants that you probably have in your house are pretty highly toxic. Again, not usually the kind that you just need to brush against to get hurt, although we will talk about that in a moment, because one of these, it is sort of that kind. But any of these, it can cause, at the very least, pretty severe stomach upset were you to eat them. Now, are you going to eat your houseplant? Probably not. That'd be a little weird. But what can, of course, are your cats and dogs. Just because something is a toxic plant doesn't mean that if they eat a leaf that you need to, immediately freak out. You do want to bring your animal to the vet, but a lot of times if they eat small quantities, it will just lead to things like diarrhea and vomiting and stomach pains, which are really unfortunate, but not necessarily lethal. Now, if they're eating, if you have the kind of dog you're gonna come back from work and it's gonna have eaten the plant, that's gonna be a little bit different. So you're gonna want to be a lot more careful in the types of plants that you have around and whether or not they're in reach. Same goes for small humans with tiny grabby hands as well. But some of the most common ones that are toxic is the pothos plants we have, the philodendrons that we have that come now are readily available in so many forms. I have probably 10 different forms and 2 cats, so I do have to be very careful. Peace lilies, another one. These might be gifted to you, something that's often received for funerals, ends up in your home, and if too much is ingested by your pet, also toxic. Dumb cane. Dumb cane's an interesting one and is so named because if you think about what we talked about with the stinging nettle, how it had those little kind of hypodermic needles that once they were broken would release the toxin. Well, dumb cane doesn't have a million little needles all over it. What it has is these packets inside of their leaves. So if something were to eat a leaf, they break those little bits, those little packages open, and that would then release the toxin. It's called dumb cane because what it usually does if people eat it is it makes them just immediately lose their voice for potentially weeks at a time. They will likely recover unless they eat a ton of it, but you will completely lose your voice. Animals are much smaller. Not only will they lose their ability to meow or bark, but they could very well die. So you want to be careful with this one. Rubber plants, if you've ever broken one, you see that little white bit of latex oozing out. Similarly, can also be an irritant for the skin, or of course, if ingested. And then pencil cactus is not really a cactus. It's a succulent. And this is a pretty common one sold in stores that also should not be ingested. I'd say to err on the side of caution, assume that your houseplant is toxic because it probably is. They on certain websites, or you can Google, they have these packages of sort of pet safe plants. If you have a pet that's going to eat it. But my biggest suggestion is just don't have your plants where something is going to be able to use its grabby paws, its grabby teeth, or grabby little baby hands to get that in their mouth, because you don't want to have to find out later. If you do ever suspect, take your animal to the vet, take your kid to the doctor, or call poison control immediately to find out what you can do. In some of these cases, you're going to want to induce vomiting as soon as possible. In some of these other cases, you absolutely don't want to induce vomiting. So you want to call poison control and figure out what your next steps are. All right, we have cleared plant territory and are working on to the fungus. All right, here we go. Here's one. I wonder if anyone recognizes this one in its association with the infamous Salem witch trials. So on this photo on the left here, you're actually looking at this parasitic fungus that works its way into wheat and grains. And subsequently, if it's ground before people understand, then it's made into flour and you actually can't even see it anymore. But it has, again, an alkaloid poison, which will constrict your blood vessels, cause seizures, nausea, uterine contractions, gangrene and hallucinations, and of course, potentially death. So this has come up numerous times in history, and they think that potentially we don't even understand all the times that this has had a severe impact on sort of historical events. But a few things. So this bottom left photo shows you what it can also look like on corn. top right image that we're looking at is a depiction of the Salem witch trials. And it's thought that because of the climatic conditions this year, that their harvest may well have had this fungus growing on it. And so when it was ground into the flour and it was eaten, it could have caused this sort of mass hysteria, these hallucinations. In the past, this bottom right photo, sometimes it has been referred to as St. Anthony's fire. It can cause this intense itching all over. Sometimes these weird dancing spells where everybody's suddenly dancing and can't stop. It's a really unpleasant experience. It's not really a fun one. Their skin is burning, it's bright red. St. Anthony's fire is also attributed to at least 2 other potential causes, but this is one. And if you're wondering why there's this very trippy graphic up in this top left, it's because you can derive LSD from one of the precursors that's in this fungus, is sort of a starting point. So don't think you're going to go find this fungus and have an LSD like trip. You're just going to poison yourself. It's just not how it works, but it is interesting what these compounds do. And so we are finding more so and more so that some of these compounds can have therapeutic effects, maybe not right out the gate. You don't just want to take a hunk of it off the ground and eat it, but we are learning more and more as these are taken off the Schedule 1 drug list, or there are some caveats that allow us to study them in a university setting where we can produce these studies that follow the scientific guidelines that we need to really learn and have quality information. Some plant poisons or toxins can add in conjunction with others, and they have this sort of antidepressant effect. Some people in really limited settings have been able to use LSD or LSD-like substances to therapeutic effect for PTSD. So this isn't something that, we want to put in the general population's water supply, but we are learning more and more to add to our existing knowledge what some of these available botanical compounds can do for us. We use a number of these already in medicine. Some of them we've learned not to use anymore. So for instance, cocaine and arsenic were in a lot of tinctures not so long ago that were given to everyone, including children. We have since learned that that's not a great idea for a number of reasons, but we do use some derivatives as necessary when the benefits outweigh the risks in medicine. All right, so now we are onto this mushroom that you probably recognize pretty well, the fly agaric, the Amanita muscaria. And this mushroom is the one that in Alice in Wonderland that the caterpillar is laying on in the beginning. It is a beautiful, beautiful and recognizable mushroom. But again, we have the ever deadly alkaloid, dizziness, delirium, intoxication, and deep sleep or coma, and of course, potentially death. The indigenous people of Siberia use or have used in the past this mushroom in ceremonial rituals. A shaman would actually swallow the mushroom himself, and then others would drink his urine to experience the psychoactive effects. Why they would do this is by it having been processed through his body, it would filter out some of those negative toxic effects like sweating and nausea and itching, improving that spiritual experience that they had. And when I mention that, I don't want to like exoticize these people from across the world, but it really does give us an insight into the cultural significance of these organisms across the board, even the toxic ones, and how they've been used ceremonially, and how our interests or our fears or our misunderstandings of them are not recent. We are on a long learning journey throughout the human population's history with these plants right alongside us. And they've had a profound impact on human history, for better or for worse in a lot of instances. And I'd hate to have been the first couple of people that had to try this mushroom to find out that it was not a good mushroom. Inky cap. This one looks kind of fake to me in like the best way possible. But this one's really interesting to me and I wanted to include it, and we'll get to questions pretty soon here in just a few minutes. But you can, if you ingest this mushroom, get sweating, nausea, dizziness, shortness of breath. But it only becomes dangerous if you drink alcohol within the next 2 weeks of eating this mushroom. And at that point, it becomes a very dangerous and deadly mushroom. But if you avoid alcohol, then you're in the clear. So if you didn't know that this was a dangerous mushroom and you didn't drink alcohol, you're great. If you did, you were in for it. And I, again, hate to be the person that had to find that out, but it goes to show the complexity of these multiple compounds that are involved with these toxins, that something like alcohol, which is not necessarily a natural occurrence that would have happened. It was not like this mushroom said, I'm going to get people, but only the ones that drink. These are just some of the interactions that we find when we are mixing these compounds, because it's in its own way, alcohol is a toxin in and of itself. For the most part, unless, maybe a couple of glasses of wine every once in a while had some heart health effect that we can read about, it's generally just something that's pretty harmful to the body and to the liver. And I could go into more detail about these, but I think that we've stuffed just about as much information for the starting presentation as we possibly could into your brains for now. So I'm going to move on to some books that I highly recommend, and I can send these out if you'd like in the email after this with the recording. But these are ones that I've had a lot of fun with and where a lot of the information that I spoke about today comes from. So I know the writing is kind of small on some of these, but I do have most of them in person with me, so I'll be able to show you. But you have Plants That Kill. This book goes much more into depth on the chemistry. So if you're really interested in like what the alkaloids are doing, what the terpenes are doing, how the plants are interacting with the cellular structures in your body, what they're doing in the brain, this is the book for you, Plants That Kill. It's really, really incredible. Wicked Plants. If you want sort of like a quick read on some of the really fun stories, like it says, the weed that killed Lincoln's mother and other botanical atrocities, that's one for you. It has a lot of fun stories and snippets about each of these poisons and their places in history. Next, you have Poison. Poison has many of the same stories as Wicked Plants, but it's not limited to plants. They have all sorts of things in here. They have animal poisons, they have arsenic, the history, lead, all the different ways that humans have hurt ourselves in history before we kind of understood what we were doing. And then finally, if you've exhausted this list, just for fun, if you want to, not eat an Inky cap, but you would like to have some alcohol, I would suggest Amy Stewart, who's also the author of Wicked Plants. She has The Drunken Botanist, which gives a little bit more placement into some of the plants that are not going to hurt you, just some of the fun ones, and how you can have a positive botanical experience at home that is creative. All right. And finally, I will put this in the chat as well, but this is how you reach out to me. I encourage you all to reach out to me. I have a lot of fun talking to you, and I hope to see you soon in person now that you can come to Teatown. It would be really great to see some of you there. And with that, I will stop sharing so I can see you all. All right, that was a lot of information. I would be happy to take some questions in a second. I will show you some of these books here, and we'll give you a better idea about what's going on in here. You get these awesome stories. The Plants That Kill book, you'll see, goes a bit more in depth into the chemical structure, which is really fascinating, of these plants and how they interact. And then I also have The Drunken Botanist here, which again, is just the fun one when you're done reading about death and destruction of people and plants, and you're going to need a drink after. This is a really fun one to do as well. All right, let me open the chat here. Is it true that dolphins prod pufferfish to get high? Okay, I don't know, but I too have read that. I'm not sure if someone drew that conclusion theoretically by watching an interaction, or whether we have some pretty good evidence. Dolphins are pretty funky and do some pretty funky things, so I can't say I'd be terribly surprised. They're incredibly intelligent, and while humans are, relatively intelligent and also partake in some instances, I wouldn't be surprised if another intelligent animal figured out a way to. But I don't know for a fact. Scopolamine as a medication comes from. Absolutely. So now I'd say in a lot of instances, people are figuring out how to make them just purely from the lab. But absolutely, I would say that this is where they're getting their derivatives from originally. They're finding that there is some positive effect, and they wanted to figure out how can we reduce the negative effects? How can we isolate this so it's not coming with those other aggressive compounds? What else we got here? Are there different types of hemlock, and are they all poisonous? Are the trees poisonous? Good point. The trees are not poisonous. I would argue if you ate too much of anything, it might qualify as poisonous, but no, the trees are not poisonous. There are multiple plants out there under the name of hemlock. This is specifically the one that is associated with the carrot and parsnip family, just like deadly nightshades. So you have a bunch of nightshades. You have tomatoes are a nightshade, eggplants are a nightshade. When certain peoples were introduced, when they brought tomatoes to Europe, none of the Europeans wanted to eat them because they knew that they were a nightshade. They have that pretty classic star at the top of the fruit that you'll see. And so the Europeans said, no, we know these as poisons. We're not going to eat them. It took some convincing. What is that? If you drink alcohol within 2 weeks of eating the inky cap, you may die. Yeah, it's super weird. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. I'm going to have to look into that more deeply. But if you eat the inky cap and you ingest alcohol in the next 2 weeks, you are in a bad spot. But if you avoid that and you don't have it for 2 weeks, you're relatively okay with minimal symptoms. It's real weird. All right, if anyone has any other questions or you just want to unmute yourself, feel free, or you want to share any sort of story, we're an open house here. But if you do want to hop off here, before anyone else leaves, I just want to say thank you so much for joining tonight. And I hope that I see you next time.